Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do what I hope will be a fun video, and that is recommending adult fantasy books for those of you that prefer to read horror and thriller books. These are books that I definitely would define as fantasy, but for one reason or another they have some horror elements in them. And of course, if you're already reading the fantasy genre, these are just plain good recommendations, books that I really enjoy, so hopefully you will too. If you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of adult fantasy as well as adult horror, science fiction, and thrillers, so definitely remember to stick around and hit subscribe if you so choose. Otherwise, let's get started. First, I want to talk about Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman, and this is a very short piece of urban fantasy that follows a man who's returning back home to the place where he grew up, and he's there for a funeral, but by coming back home it evokes some memories of things that are long forgotten. He had formed a friendship with a young girl named Letty at the time, and they went on adventures, these magical adventures, and they went off to what they considered to be this ocean or this pool of water, and possibly some fantastical creatures were there, possibly some dark creatures that they had to fight. And I like a story like this because it's definitely meant for adults. It's not framed as a childhood story, but rather a coming of age story that is written through the lens of someone who is now an adult looking back on his childhood. So it deals with a lot of adult themes because even the man, his father at the time, was possibly having an affair, and you get to see that as an adult and realize that there was more going on. And I also like that it's one of those stories that plays with the idea of, well, is it fantasy? Was there something magical happening? Or is it just a child's imagination? And I have heard people describe this as a horror book, but personally, when I read it as someone who reads a lot of horror, while I never want to gatekeep, I just don't see it as that horrifying. It doesn't really quite hit the tropes of the genre, but almost. It's dark, it's creepy, but for me it's more of a fantastical fairy tale, and it doesn't quite hit on some of those really dark, horrific moments that you would probably expect from a horror story. But again, if you like a darker twist on fantasy, I think that this one is very approachable, great for beginners to the genre as well as anyone who just loves these classic fantasy stories. Highly recommend. Next, we have Devil's Night Dawning by Damien Black, which is the first book in an epic fantasy series. And within this series, we follow multiple perspectives, but one being an apprentice to an exorcist. And so right at the beginning of the story, we follow them as they are proceeding to exorcise a demon. There's also other characters in the story, a maiden, a knight, and more classic, traditional epic fantasy characters that are introduced. But of course, for those of you that love horror, as I do, you probably are very interested in the fact that this, as I mentioned, has that possession and exorcism element, because just like in our world, supposedly, there are these demons that can inhabit beings, and then you need these religious figures to come and get the demons out. And so if you love that narrative and you love fantasy, this is a great place to try and see how they come together. I will admit that this book definitely reads like epic fantasy and really slow, dense fantasy. There's a lot of conversation about religious ideas, a lot of world building, and it's definitely one that I would not recommend unless you already like fantasy. But again, if you like both genres, this is a really cool place where they intersect. Otherwise, besides the exorcism angle, it does read like very traditional fantasy, so again, it depends on your preference within the genre, but it's a really interesting one, and one that I personally don't hear talked about very often, so wanted to recommend it here. Next up is a fantasy book that I'm always trying to sneak into horror recommendation videos, but it's technically urban fantasy, and that is Swashbucklers by Dan Hanks. And this is a story that is set primarily in our present day, but the backstory is that back in the 1980s, there was possibly this gas leak that caused people to hallucinate and see monsters, and people died. However, the children at that time realized that it wasn't actually a gas leak and possibly something more was going on. There was a monster that they had to fight. And now the story begins with them coming back as adults because another death has taken place, and so they believe that the monsters are back and they need to fight them again. While that definitely has the setup for a Stephen King-esque story in the vein of something like It or Stranger Things, the TV show, this definitely reads more like portal fantasy and is just more fantastical and humorous than scary, but it still hits on those tropes and it just takes them to a really fun place. So if you're looking for relief between between really heavy, gruesome horror books, and you're open to reading something that again is more fantastical in design, this is a great one to pick up. I had so much fun reading it, and I feel like I'm always recommending it, but again, technically it's fantasy, but I really think that those of you that come to my channel looking for horror books would really enjoy this as a great palate cleanser when you need something a little bit more light and fun. Next up, we have The Helm of Midnight by Marina J. Lastatter, which is the first book in a series. Within this series, the story starts out in this city and we follow multiple perspectives on multiple timelines. And the main setup is that we follow an inspector who is hunting down someone who has stolen the mask of a serial killer. Within this world, there is magic that allows people to imbue objects with emotions, and this mask belonged to a serial killer that was convicted and killed. And so it appears that the mask has been stolen and is now being used by a copycat. And of course they have to hunt that person down. This mask is very dangerous and that person needs to be stopped. We also get some other perspectives, which I won't spoil, but you can probably guess what they might be. And I really enjoyed this story. I enjoyed the magic system. I thought it was really creative. But of course, primarily again, as someone who loves a lot of thrillers, I really enjoyed the fact that it was a fantasy book with a serial killer in it. I will admit that as someone who reads a lot of really dark and messed up serial killer books, this one is really tame. I've heard other people who primarily read fantasy thought this book was a lot more gruesome. I did not see that, but again, I might just be desensitized, so keep that in mind depending on where you're coming from as a reader. But I really love the setup. I thought it was very creative and you get to see how the timelines fit together. There's some really good twists and turns, which I will not spoil here. And yeah, if you like that premise, if you want a fantasy book that is a little bit different, in a way it's epic, but I would also say that it feels much more intimate because at least in this first book, it all takes place in one city. So it's a lot more contained and has that urban setting, but a secondary world. So it is not our own. And I just thought it was a lot of fun. So obviously highly recommend. Next, I want to mention Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and this is a vampire story that takes place in Mexico. In this world, vampires are not a secret. Instead, people know that vampires exist. However, because of their status as being vampires, they really tend to live on the margins of society. They struggle to get jobs and tend to just really live in poverty. And we follow a vampire who gets entangled with another person who is also struggling at the margins of society, and they form this friendship. They live together platonically and you get to see the story unfold. This book has incredible world building. I typically do not like vampire stories, but I like this take on them. I like the idea that the vampires were known, that they are not hidden in the dark. And I also like the fact that this book takes different Mexican and Mayan ideas and brings that into the backstory of the vampires and kind of adds to the lore that way, in a way that I find a little bit less traditional than some of the more European style lore that I have seen. So I thought it was very interesting. I will admit, in terms of plot, I found it to be a little bit skim. And technically, yes, I know a lot of people could say this book is horror, and definitely it has horror elements, but for me, it still read more like urban fantasy. It has some gruesome moments, but for me, again, as someone who reads a lot of horror, it felt more like urban fantasy, so I felt pretty safe to put it in this video here. Next, we have The Emperor's Railroad by Guy Haley, and this is a fantasy novella that is set in a secondary world where we follow a young boy who is on the run with his mother. They end up meeting up with this really cool knight-like character who protects them. He has a sword, and what he is protecting them from is basically the fantasy version of a plague of zombies. And so again, this book is definitely fantasy in nature, and it's not truly horrifying. It's much more of a character story than a zombie story. The zombies are a little bit more in the background, but the zombies are definitely there, which again makes me want to recommend this to anyone who loves horror zombie stories. I love the subgenre, but I know it doesn't get a lot of love online. But if you're open to that, if you're looking for a story that's just really fun, again, it's a novella, so it does read very quickly. I think the characters are a little bit of archetypes. Again, the main guy with the sword is just cool and suave, and maybe a little bit bit predictable, but I liked that. I thought he was a lot of fun, and again, I enjoyed kind of people swinging a sword at zombies instead of, you know, guns and more traditional ammo that you see in kind of modern takes on the genre. So yeah, if you're open to zombies, please consider this one. Then we have The Haunting of Tramcar 15 by P. Djeli Clark, and this is a fantasy story set in a different historical version of Cairo, Egypt. And within the story, there are beings or spirits that can possess objects. And so there is actually a whole government sub-office that is in charge of dealing with these possessions. And so we follow two investigators that are sent off because, as the title suggests, this tram car is possibly possessed. It ends up being something a little bit different. But again, if you're open to a fantasy story that explores the idea of possession and exorcism, this one has a really interesting twist on it. But I will say it definitely reads like fantasy. It's not scary at all. The world building is really the reason to read the story, along with the character work, and it's just very unique. But is it scary? No, not whatsoever. But again, I'm someone who loves possession stories in any form, so I was eager to check it out and really ended up enjoying it. And if you are open to graphic novels, I also want to recommend one called Water Snakes. And this follows a girl that is going on vacation, ends up meeting with this other girl. They become friends. This other girl is just quite strange. She seems to be almost lost in a world of imagination. And it's a hard book to describe, but it's one that basically draws the line between fantasy and horror and just kind of hovers between the two. I've recommended it for both fans of the two genres, and it's one that is just great because, again, it kind of plays into the idea of, is it someone's imagination or something really horrific happening? And the imagery is so dark and disturbing. It involves teeth and just goes to some really strange places. It's so unique. And again, I have recommended it in horror graphic novels, but really it's probably more on the fantasy side. So again, if you're open to a graphic work, this is definitely my pick for a fantasy book that I think horror readers will love as well. And finally, I want to talk about Shadow of the Short Days, which is a book translated from Iceland where the story takes place and is written. And it's technically a piece of urban fantasy, but it almost reads more like epic fantasy due to the scale of the story. This is a story of rebellion because we have a group of oppressed people that are fighting against the government. We have multiple perspectives, one being of a man who is going through a magical school, and he ends up getting in trouble because he doesn't want to obey the rules and is looking into forbidden magic. And we have characters that have different magical abilities. I love the magic system in here, which involves using creative arts like graffiti and imbuing it with magical purposes. And I just thought this book was just so fantastical and so unique, so different than so much of the fantasy I read. But it definitely gets dark. It has some really dark moments, some harm to animals potentially, and it goes pretty crazy by the end. I thought it was just fantastic. Possibly gets a little bit like cosmic in the style of horror. And if you enjoy, again, really dark fantasy that leans into horror, this is one I have to recommend. Again, I feel it is so underhyped and I love it so much. I'm constantly trying to get more people to read it, so hopefully I convinced a few of you today. So that is it for this video here. I'd love to hear of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I'd also love to hear your recommendations for a fantasy book that you would recommend to someone who primarily reads horror or thriller novels. So if I haven't read it yet, I'm definitely wanting to check it out. If you're new to my channel, consider subscribing. I do read both adult fantasy as well as adult horror, and then thrillers and science fiction. You can still help me out by giving this video a thumbs up, sharing it around online. If you drop a little emoji as a comment, it helps me out too. And if you hit the little notification bell, you'll never miss another video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.